ours in the great books of the Western tradition, starting with the ancient Greeks and Romans and the Bible, and working our way up to the American founding and our own American institution. And we'll also be offering, we hope, some study abroad opportunities in places like Rome, and summer institutes for business students, engineering students, and others to benefit from that kind of a program. As I say, it's anchored in what's been called the great books sort of approach, reading, not just reading about, but actually reading and engaging the great thinkers and writers of the past, Plato, Shakespeare, Locke, and so on, interacting with students and with scholars on the ideas, those crucial ideas that are raised there, and becoming part of that ongoing conversation, a 2,500-year-old conversation that makes up the Western tradition. So there's more information about that on our website, or you can email me, and I'd be happy to tell you more. I'm just going to run through briefly the past history of our series so we can sort of situate where we are at the moment. First speaker was Harry Lewis from Harvard College. He talked about some of the recent experiences there in thinking through their core curriculum. We had Professor Robert George from Princeton, who's the director of the James Madison Center, and talked about civic literacy as a part of higher education. Dr. Victor Davis Hanson spoke to us about the ancient Greeks and Western civilization, the influence that they've had, and what we can learn, what we need to learn from the Greeks. Waichi Dimmock from Yale, also talking about Greek literature, the Iliad and its relevance to us today. Professor Martha Nussbaum from University of Chicago, talking about freedom of conscience. Michael Berube, who is at Penn State University, and also gave another quite a different perspective on the curriculum. Last month, Professor Daniel Allen, who's at the Institute for Advanced Study now in Princeton. And then tonight, Dr. Herbert London, who's the president of the Hudson Institute in New York City, and he's the former dean, actually the founding dean of the Gallatin School at NYU, and the author of 21 books altogether, and I hear there's a 22nd that will soon be out. Dr. London got his BA in Columbia and his PhD at NYU, and these are a few of the books that he's written, several of which have become television series that he also produced. And he's going to speak to us tonight about the struggle for the college curriculum. So please join me in welcoming Dr. London.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening. I think this is an extremely important series, and I feel privileged to be a part of it. Let me start by talking a little bit about my own background, and I promise not to talk too long. On several occasions, I've had the opportunity to introduce Henry Kissinger, and I always say, here's a man who needs no introduction. Mr. Kissinger usually whispers at that point, but I so love to hear it. But I'm not going to go into that part of my history, except that whenever I received a very elaborate introduction, I'm reminded of a story. I wasn't going to tell this story, but I think it might be an appropriate way to begin this conversation. In the year 1910, it was a rather eventful year in New York, in part because there was a party that was created by a New Yorker named Teddy Roosevelt. It was the Bull Moose Party. And the Bull Moose Party was challenging the Republicans. The chairman of the Republican Party in those years was a man named Chauncey Depew. He was not only head of the Republican Party, he was also the senior senator from New York. And he wrote to the President of the United States, William Howard Taft, and he said, we're facing a significant challenge, and I think you ought to come to New York to rouse the Republicans. William Howard Taft said, look, I'm very busy in Washington. I cannot be bothered with this, and I don't really regard the TR threat very seriously. Well, Chauncey wrote to him again and said, look, you're very wrong. You've got to come. And still the president refused. Finally, he wrote him a letter that was irresistible. He said, I'm going to take you to your favorite restaurant. Now, those of you who know American history will remember that William Howard Taft was the largest president to ever appear in the White House. He weighed about 350 pounds. In fact, so large was William Howard Taft that the doors in the White House had to be expanded to accommodate his girth. That's how big this man was. And he loved his food. Chauncey Depew was very much aware of that, and he said, we're going to go to your favorite restaurant on 48th Street, just off 6th Avenue, and then afterwards I'm going to take you to the Harper Hotel, no longer in existence, and you will speak to the Republicans who are assembled. Well, Chauncey Depew was a very, very compelling figure. In fact, very well known in New York because he had all of these witty comments. When someone once asked him, what do you do to exercise? He said, I carry the coffins of my friends who have exercised. So he was a very clever guy, and he was the fellow who also raised the money for the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. He was a well-known, very well-known figure, and very famous for his flowery statements and flowery speeches. Well, finally, William Howard Taft goes to this restaurant. Goes to the restaurant, he has 12 courses. It's an enormous amount of food. And in fact, in some instances, he has 2 and 3 of each of the dishes. When the meal is finally finished, William Howard Taft walks over to the Harper Hotel with Chauncey Depew, and Chauncey Depew says to him, look, you stay in the back of the auditorium, and I'll tell you when to come forward. But just stay back there. And he goes into a very elaborate statement about the president. We have with us today an extraordinary man, William Howard Taft. Let me tell you, one of the great presidents in American history. This is a man who is pregnant with virtue. And now emotions. Now here's a man with this distended stomach after all of these courses who's walking down the aisle going towards the podium. It says not only is he pregnant with virtue, here's a man who is pregnant with integrity. More laughter from the audience. William Howard Taft is walking, his belly is parading in front of him, finally comes up, and he says, ladies and gentlemen, if I have a girl, I will name her virtue. If I have a boy, I will name him integrity. But since what I have is gas, I will name it Chauncey Depew. I just love that story. It kind of destroys all punctures balloons whenever people get elaborate introductions. Let me get to the topic at hand, because that really is the purpose of my being here. I want to talk about the nature of the curriculum and the way in which it's changed in recent years and what I consider to be an appropriate way to look at this issue. What is the appropriate curriculum for students? What happened to the consensus on which the college curriculum once rested? Together, these two questions, I think, combine what I would regard as the central issue in contemporary higher education. It seems to me that the criticisms of Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind of 2 decades ago are symptomatic of the problems we are facing. High standards are described as elitism, a pejorative of scathing proportions. A call for the assertion of Western tradition is characterized as racist and anti-democratic. And Bloom's critique of radical feminism as a virus let loose on the curriculum is greeted with cries of phallocentrism. The college curriculum as a source of youthful enlightenment, free of the impediments of bias and prejudice, has unraveled. While Stanley Katz, president of the American Council of Learned Societies, recently noted that scholars are less politicized in the United States than in any country in the developed world, and I'm quoting him, he neglected to point out that a profound and revolutionary change has occurred on American campuses, and almost every American campus, I might add. For a generation, students have been fed on the studies curriculum, whether it's women's studies, gay studies, environmental studies, peace studies, Chicano studies, that are designed to indoctrinate students about pathologies in contemporary American culture, specifically race, class, gender, and environmental oppression. Moreover, philosopher Richard Rorty argued that secular professors in the university, and I'm quoting again, ought to arrange things so that students who enter as bigoted, homophobic, religious fundamentalists will leave college with views more like our own. Rorty noted that students are fortunate to find themselves under the control of people like me and to have escaped the grip of their frightening, vicious, dangerous parents. Indeed, parents who send their children to college should recognize that as professors, and I quote again, we are going to go right on trying to discredit you in the eyes of your children, trying to strip your fundamentalist religious community of dignity, trying to make your views seem silly rather than discussable. Even if one agrees with Dr. Katz that scholars are less politicized in the United States than other places, a statement that's very hard to justify after listening to Rorty, or considers my description somewhat exaggerated, there are certain assumptions about higher education that are likely to be accepted. One is that some matters should be studied by all students. And another is that the welfare of society depends on some knowledge and appreciation of the basic ideas that undergird this democratic polity. These generalizations in themselves rarely cause a heated reaction, but their application in a society as diverse and perhaps as atomistic as ours makes them intrinsically volatile. William Bennett, in his book, Our Children and Our Country, noted that there is no longer an overarching, well-understood purpose for the university. In the past, some distant, imprecise past, all activities were ancillary to teaching, including research and publication. Today, however, the university's purpose is manifold. Research, administration, publication, affirmative action, redressing real and perceived social ills, therapy for the middle-class kids suffering from the ravages of divorce and neglect, ideological indoctrination, what I have called in another context the Derridaization of the curriculum, where in fact the professor becomes the center of the curriculum and provides the hidden keys to understanding, the Rosetta Stone of understanding, which is what Derrida did. And of course, occasionally teaching. The honored disciplines are still taught, and some are less contaminated by the political virus than others. But along with them is a heavy overlay of deconstruction, Lacanism, Marxism, semiotics, minimalism, hermeneutics of everything except the Bible, self-studies, ethnic studies, and theory about every matter to which a theory can possibly be applied. As I see it, education is the ability to make sense of the chaotic world of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, through the prism of eternal truths, filtered down through the past. But if there isn't a truth to be pursued, all views will appear as relative and essentially nonsensical. Let me illustrate this point with a Hasidic tale recounted by Martin Buber. The story involves the consuming desire of Reb Yitzhak Yaakov of Poland to encounter the prophet Elijah. Elijah, according to the Bible, did not die. He was carried off to heaven in a fiery chariot, and ever since, Jewish tradition has it, he has regularly been sent on various missions throughout the world under disguise to hasten the coming of the Messiah. To satisfy his desire, Reb Yitzhak Yaakov would dress himself in peasant's garb and with a companion wander through the streets and markets of neighboring villages, hoping by chance or by God's grace to meet the prophet Elijah. One day, as they were walking down a typically unpaved and sandy street, they met a peasant walking towards them, leading a donkey on a halter. Yitzhak grabbed his companion's arm in deep agitation. "There he is," he cried. But the peasant glared at him with fiery eyes. "Yehudi, Yehudi," he thundered. Yehudi means Jew. "Yehudi, if you know, why must you speak?" And in an instant, Elijah disappeared. Now, as I see it, the encounter with Elijah in this tale conveyed the assurance so ardently desired by Yitzhak that a designed purpose exists. It was a dazzling sign that there is a latent meaning and a body of principles governing the world, which to many seems devoid of both. But why, one might ask, although Buber does not, was Elijah angry? Why did he disappear as soon as he was identified? And to ask a third question, which on first blush may seem frivolous, what happened to the donkey? I shall return to these questions in due course. But first I'd like to ask why the curriculum consensus on our campuses has unraveled. Some might be tempted to argue that this situation is a reflection of the disorder of our times, in which false and perverse notions are employed in order to enhance faculty authority and preferences. Others argue that the curriculum has been undone by a process of academic log rolling among the established disciplines, unfettered by any transcendent idea of the good or even the desirable. Still another view is that the inability of the curriculum reflects a desire to keep up with the shifting ideas of intellectual fashion. All one has to do is to turn to almost any core catalog in a major university in the United States, and you will see that faculty members have by and large abdicated responsibility to determine what is a university education. Clearly, it would be unwise to argue that the curriculum should be narrowly sectarian. I'm reminded of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi's response to a French ambassador who earnestly spoke of friendly relations between the two nations. Gaddafi nodded and then said, "Oh, it would be so much easier if the French were to convert to Islam." As professors, we are constrained by the reality of cultural, religious, and ethnic differences, which make an inflexible curriculum improbable. But that in no way obviates the need for a common core that transmits the depositive wisdom of our civilization and poses the essential questions of life. How should I live? What is the good life? What can I hope for? What must I do? How do I find the truth? Or that provides students with knowledge about the democratic polity of which they are citizens. Though we are all living in a durably enigmatic universe and following paths through life which lead each one of us to his death, we all want or should want to know what we are doing here or what we must do to give our lives value and overcome the apparent derision of death, which threatens to deprive all of our efforts and accomplishments of any lasting significance. Higher education in itself cannot address this yearning. At its best, it refines the questions and establishes a path for the pursuit of answers. Yet my concern is that the typical college curriculum does not ask the important questions, does not encourage the quest for real self and community knowledge, and substitutes the wisdom on which this civilization was founded for that which has current and evanescent meaning. It is ironic that at the moment we have eviscerated meaning from the curriculum, academics are urgently calling for values education, a recurrent phrase in the pages of the Chronicle of Higher Education. But what is this values education to be? The emergence of cultural relativism that has elicited the belief that our culture is one of many others, deserving no particular praise or even attention? As the web of symbols which in every culture designates the ultimate values from which moral rules are derived is subject to rational exegesis and then refutation, a vacuum results which most high-minded scholars don't have the foggiest idea of how to fill. Moreover, the scientific worldview on which scholarly discourse depends provides only one, and by no means the most important one, the only dimension of the values that we should imbibe. This leaves us in a double bind. The call for values in the curriculum occurs in a social setting characterized by accelerated change, a scientific view, a skepticism about religion, a fascination with that which is fashionable, and the emergence of a peculiar orthodoxy which relies on relativism except when it comes to women, blacks, and the third world. One cannot bring back the past, despite my wish, but neither can one forget the past. While there are many ways to pursue curriculum reform and many viewpoints in any direction, I would argue that the way toward the reassertion of common sense involves a renewed consideration of those that deal with our fundamental humanity. Rejecting the compromise of standards that has afflicted higher education since the 1960s, and again, nothing precise about that date, we should carry the torch like a government in exile for the highest value, that which is irrefutably common to all students, the desire to question and to know. In that sense, we are all like Reb Yitzhak Yaakov, wandering through the streets in search of a presence that will confirm our faith and our humanity, that will certify we are not adrift in an inhuman and meaningless universe, headed for a meaningless death. This is the common bond we share, and it is upon that search that the curriculum should be constructed. This brings me to another of my questions from the allegorical tale. Why was Elijah angry? He was angry, I contend, because while people may be allowed to sense his presence, they cannot presume to point it out and give it a name. The time was not yet ripe for revelation, because in the Jewish tradition, the Messiah had not come, and preparation for his coming made everything precarious. Hence, one should not designate this hidden force, nor utter the name of God capriciously. Elijah disappeared because he was designated and named. Yitzhak said aloud what should have been left unspoken and acknowledged only in the heart. If I may apply Yitzhak's dilemma to the academy, the highest value is potentially ripened within the walls of our colleges. The nostalgic need often expressed for a human world would find its expression only in the quest for what is most authentically human. That is not a quest limited to the last 2 decades or even to the last 2 centuries. It is a search for answers to those universal questions that transcend the latest cause or ism and go right to the essence of being human. The 19th century Polish poet, Cyprian Norwood, faced with the crude demand for truth, saved his neck by replying that man is not yet ripe. He is a priest without knowing it. What I think he meant by that phrase is that, like Yitzhak, each of us is a questioner, a mediator between the highest value and the banality of quotidian responsibility, between a world that is dreadfully predictable and a future charged with possibilities. Those are the real parameters of curriculum decisions, not whether the voices of femininity, color, or the third world will be represented in the reading list, but whether those readings and questions bring us closer to the true sense of our common humanity. Now for the last of my questions. What happened to the donkey that Elijah was leading down the dusty village street? I suspect, since I don't have this from a higher authority, I can only share my suspicion, that when the prophet disappeared, the donkey ambled down the street and stopped at a water fountain. There he was picked up by a man who had witnessed the encounter and knew the donkey belonged to the prophet Elijah. Realizing the animal was granted special powers, he was sent to the university where he was given an endowed chair in semiotics at the University of California. While Elijah in my story is the searing, unrelenting, illuminating questioner, the donkey is no more than a precocious and false answer. One might say the donkey is the golden calf, a firm answer to a question that requires no answering. Like so many subjects in the contemporary curriculum, there are questions that do not really deserve our attention. For example, can peace be established through the elimination of nuclear weapons? Is race the only way to evaluate societies? Should hermeneutics be reduced to gender? I can obviously go on with many other examples. The essence of the curriculum is desire. The desire to go beyond oneself and to ask the questions that cut across time and place. The extent to which scholars revisit the issue of the curriculum with this desire in mind is the test of whether true educational attainment is being encouraged. I'm not sanguine about the prospects, but like my belief in Elijah, some matters are better left unsaid, and faith is still the great harbinger of change. Harold Hodgkinson, former director of the National Institute of Education, wrote, and I quote again, "The American public school curriculum is quintessentially European in nature, from the language it teaches to the music sung by its choirs. Although it is more relevant to blacks than in the past, there is still much to work on. And when to the curriculum as it is learned by all Asians and South Americans and Islanders, we are truly flying blind." Here, in a rather unvarnished form, is the view that the school curriculum must be responsive to the novel set of ambient conditions summarized most often in the phrase, "the new demographics." Presumably, the growing number of students of African, Asian, Caribbean, Hispanic origin in our schools has rendered the pedagogical assumptions of the past obsolete and necessitates a wholly new approach based on diversity, multiculturalism, and quote-unquote relevant materials. Admittedly, the United States is an integral part of an increasingly global civilization, and our schools will perforce be spending more class time than has hitherto been the case on the histories, politics, cultures, and economics of the non-Western parts of the world. Yet the essential character of American culture remains Western, as is most manifest in its steadfast denial of the importance of ancestry and its emphasis on universal values such as individual freedom and social justice. To the extent we agree on the importance of preserving these ideals, there is obviously a need for a common understanding of acculturation, one that includes the Magna Carta, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, the works of Shakespeare, Franklin, Jefferson, et al. Indeed, if the principles of ethnic, racial, and religious tolerance are to be perpetuated in America, the provenance of individual rights and dignity, a belief in justice for all, and a faith in the rule of law must be imbibed. Of course, our educational system should not be indifferent to the varied ethnic roots of the American people. Americans have long understood that hyphenated loyalty, coupling a fondness of the old country with aspiration toward eventual assimilation, represents a feasible and satisfying compromise between what otherwise might be considered warring psychological forces. What is wrong-headed and patronizing, however, is to argue that black Americans, to use one illustration, have a special need for an African-centered curriculum. Certainly, if a major curriculum goal is to explore the case for constitutionally guaranteed civil rights, John Stuart Mill, a white Western male, speaks far more eloquently than Malcolm X of Frantz Fanon. Moreover, it hardly bodes well for the future to assign those students who are already disadvantaged only work or ideas consonant with their visceral, racial, or ethnic loyalties. These may be relevant in some superficial sense, but in the long term, an excessive dose of such readings will handicap them as assuredly as will a lack of familiarity with arithmetic. It was recently reported that several Oregon schools, for example, are adopting the Mexican public school curriculum to help educate Spanish-speaking students with textbooks provided by the Mexican government in math, science, and, yes, American history. It is instructive that several black organizations argued a few years ago that the Scholastic Aptitude Test was discriminatory. Cited as evidence for this claim was a verbal analogies question in which the correct answer was the word regatta. It was alleged by some black leaders that since blacks are disadvantaged and culturally insulated, they could not possibly know what a regatta is. Yet at about the same time these allegations were made, a young emigre from Cambodia, who had been in this country only 3 years, won the National Spelling Bee with the word daiquiri. What makes this illustration poignant is that this Cambodian girl had entered the United States without knowledge of the English language or American customs, and certainly without any familiarity with our national drinks. Presumably, what she did have, however, was a strong desire to master the ways of her new homeland. If the demographics suggest anything at all about the future course of American education, it is the need to re-emphasize our traditional ideals of high achievement and preparation for common citizenship. This will not only preserve an American environment in which all can work and share in a spirit of brotherhood, but will also provide us with a frame of reference that will legitimate meaning to the study of other societies. Moreover, our reasons for studying other societies are not primarily to be found in the changing mix of ancestral backgrounds that characterizes the national student body. Our interest in the experience of other peoples derives instead from a concern with the fundamental questions that affect all human beings. Who are we? How can we find enduring satisfaction in our lives? What are our responsibilities to other individuals and succeeding generations? How do we wish to be governed? What is the larger shape of the universe in which we live? Curiously, the curriculum that is most effective by minorities and others, for females and males, for poor and rich, is one that encourages reasoned reflection about these commonalities of the human condition, that offers the best that is known and written, and provides some knowledge of the depositive wisdom of civilization. To deny the veracity of this claim by assigning marginal works is to handicap greatly the very students who so desperately need our best academic counsel. Thank you very much. Now your questions. No questions? I find that hard to believe. Yes, sir.
You talked some about values education. I wonder if you could say more about what is appropriate in educating people for a common core of values. How would you go about that, and how would you try to structure the curriculum so that it promotes it?
Well, my own feeling about this is that the classic texts in Western civilization provide a wonderful background. I mean, reading Plato and Aristotle is a good start. Understanding the Bible, reading Shakespeare. I think these are works that are essential and critical in understanding not only our civilization, but some of the basic concepts. People will often say, well, they're not timely, or this only represents a kind of narrowly parochial view of the world. On the contrary, the reason why these books have lasting value is because they do concern themselves with transcendent concerns that go across time and place, as I've suggested. So I think you start with the essential and most important works that this civilization has created. And my feeling is that if you start the curriculum in that fashion, Western civilization not only takes on great meaning, but it serves as a way of foreshadowing a discussion of other societies and other cultures. Yes, please.
I would like to suggest, besides the Western texts like Plato and the Bible, when other Eastern texts like Journey to the West, or the Indian Hindu texts, would they be relevant in teaching?
The Upanishads. I mean, look, there are great works that have been produced in other cultures. That's certainly not deniable, and that's not a point that I'm trying to make here. I'm merely suggesting to you that the way to begin, the way to start, is for people to understand in this society, in this Western society, our Western traditions first. There's also no doubt that there is a relationship between much of what happened in the West and much of what has happened elsewhere. The great Japanese filmmaker who made the Kurosawa was tremendously influenced by Shakespeare. In fact, a number of his films really emerged from the themes in Macbeth. And so I think that there is a relationship. But the point that I'm trying to make here is not that one denies the study of the great works of other civilizations. And surely there is great work in other civilizations. I'm merely saying that for students who enter the academy, the first and perhaps overarching concern should be an understanding of their own traditions and the works that gave rise to the kind of unique culture that we have in the United States. Yes, sir.
Do you have any comment on the fact? I think I'm loud enough, but okay. Do you have any comment on the fact that such a large percent of students who enter college in the United States are unprepared academically and have to take remedial courses?
Not only am I very much aware of it, I had to confront it. I mean, this is a problem that I think is ubiquitous in higher education. And I think it's a truly lamentable situation. I was interviewed today for a television program in Canada, and someone said to me, what do you think is the most important thing for a voting public? And I said, a voting public has to be educated. And the person who was asking the question could barely put three words together. And I tried to make the point that words are ideas incarnate. If you don't know how to use language, you're going to have a very, very difficult way of, it's going to be very difficult for you to think any sophisticated thoughts. And this person who was asking the question came to the realization that he couldn't even ask the question properly. And I do find that this is a real problem. Most students, in part because of the democratization of higher education in the United States, are given a wonderful opportunity to attend a university. They don't know how to take advantage of that opportunity. And faculty members, as I suggested to you before, are on the other side of this equation because they've abdicated responsibility and have simply said to students, you've got this Chinese menu. Take a couple of courses from column A, a couple of courses from column B, and a couple of courses from column C, and you've satisfied the requirements for this program. I don't really think that's what an education should be. There was a time not so long ago when the college catalog wasn't quite so thick. Now, obviously, you've added courses because we've become a lot more sophisticated about the sciences. But if you look at the Yale, and I just went through this, by the way, if you look at the Yale catalog in 1897, and the Yale catalog today, it went from 15 pages to 647 pages. Now, what do you have in the 647 pages? Well, if you're going to take a history course, you can take the history of film. If you can take a philosophy course, you can take a philosophy course that deals with some kind of abstraction. You never really deal with what faculty members think is appropriate for an education, largely because they're not sure themselves. And so this has become a great problem. And if you have students who are ill-equipped to read books like The Republic or to read Aristotle, then you've got a real problem on your hands. And that's one of the reasons why we've seen the general dumbing down of American education. Many of the students are ill-prepared. Years ago, when I'm associated with a place called the Hudson Institute, and the institute was located in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I had a chance to meet with the governor of the state. And he said to me, what would you do in order to improve education in the state? I said, one, I would have real graduation requirements. He said, it's a terrific idea. Why don't you put that down on paper and tell me what you think a student ought to know before he graduates from a high school in Indiana? And I did so. And to my astonishment, he actually got the legislature to pass a series of tests. Now, in the first year that the tests were given to people who were in the 12th grade, one of the remarkable things that happened is only 22% of the students in Indiana prepared to graduate, that is, having met all of the requirements, could pass the test. Now, you can imagine what happened to the governor. There were complaints from 80% of the population in Indiana saying, you can't impose these rigorous requirements on our students. They did everything that was necessary to pass. Now you give them a graduation test, and they're not passing. So we had to dilute the test. So the next year, 31% passed. But still, there were too many complaints. And in the end, the governor decided to simply abandon the test completely. So what you have is political pressure. There is not a real desire for excellence in the schools. There's a desire for people to get a union card. And unfortunately, what university education has become is very much like that, where people are looking for a union card, a way to enter the workplace and say, I have a bachelor's degree. And that is a very real issue. It's the commercialization of higher education. And you will also notice, and one other dimension of this, and I'm sorry to be so long-winded, is that there are more students who major in business than major in Western civilization or English or history. Well, why? Because there's simply the practical concerns. How am I going to make a living? How am I going to take this enormous investment that I've made in higher education and translate it into a reasonable rate of return? And what is the rate of return? It's a job in the financial community or a job in some business or being an executive at some major company. And so education has become very, very practical. And I think in some ways that's quite unfortunate. It's not to say that there isn't a need for some kind of practical education. I believe in praxis. But I also believe that it's necessary to have the kind of foundation that you should get in a university education before you go out into the world. And the last point I would make is that in the year 2000, the Gallup poll offered an examination to 27,000, I think the number was 27 or 37,000 students across the United States who were prepared to graduate from American universities. And this involved state universities and private universities, elite institutions, not so elite institutions, rich schools, poor schools, all kinds of institutions in the United States. And there were somewhere between 27 or 37, I can't remember the number. And they were asked 25 questions that you would assume the average person would understand. My mother, who was a high school dropout, answered all 25 questions correctly. And the questions were, who was the president of the United States during World War II? How do you find the area of a rectangle? Or who said of the people, by the people, for the people? By the way, the most common answer was Jefferson, not Lincoln. Who wrote the Republic? Who was responsible for, just trying to think, well, who was president during the Korean War? questions of that kind. Common knowledge. I mean, these weren't difficult questions. Who wrote the Canterbury Tales? And it was 25 questions. The remarkable thing was only 11% of the people who took this examination, and that number I do remember, only 11%, could get 20 or more questions correct of the 25. And as I said, some of the answers were really quite remarkable. Now, every once in a while, I have great difficulty watching Jay Leno, but every once in a while I turn on Jay Leno, and I think that these people are really staged. And he's talking to people on the streets, and he asks them a common question like, where is the White House located? Oh, they say down the block, just where my mother lives. I mean, it's more remarkable. And so there is a kind of level of general ignorance that's quite astonishing. And that makes it very difficult to teach, very, very difficult. And I must say I had that same problem when I was in the academy and I was trying to teach, and I became very frustrated because on one occasion I remember giving a lecture at a very well-known institution that will remain nameless, and I said to the students who were present, well, that was his Achilles heel. I was talking about the 1948 election. I happened to mention that expression. A kid came up to me and said, what is this business about an Achilles heel? Well, it's just a common expression. I thought, you know, any reasonably intelligent person would know what I was suggesting. That wasn't the case. So this is an issue. And my feeling about it is I think that you should provide first, second, even third chance education for students in the United States. But if they're not prepared to enter the corridors of higher education, they shouldn't be there. Yes, sir.
Right here first.
I have two questions. The first is about a great books, curriculum education, and I think it's a good thing and all. But what happens when you sort of enter this 2,500-year debate, and you read these authors, and you sort of recognize that they disagree, and then what happens to the student who sort of throws up his hands? Well, they all say different things about this or that. So where am I to come down? What do you do about the relativism that may result from a great books curriculum?
Well, first of all, one of the things that's important to understand is I don't expect Kant to agree with Hegel, and I certainly don't expect Plato to necessarily agree with Aristotle. Surely there are going to be differences. But what emerges from a reading of the great books is you can start developing this consensus. The consensus emerges from it. This is the tradition, the Western tradition. And so it's the students themselves that start to understand why a consensus is needed. What is unique about this polity? What is unique about the individualism we enjoy? What is unique about the nature of the free market? What is unique about democracy? These terms might even need definitions, but the fact of the matter is that what emerges from this great reading list is that you will see the world very differently. And keep in mind that if you turn to Arnold, who made the point about reading the best that is known and the best that's written, if you read the second part of his statement, he said, these books are like looking at a brook that is rumbling through, that has just gone through a storm. And as the brook goes through the storm, it may move in many different directions, and it may even be quite turbulent. But in the end, it provides direction for what we are trying to seek, and that is minds that are not only literate, but are capable of understanding. Now, I don't want to overstate the importance of great books, because the person who engaged in the most horrible experiments during the Holocaust, Joseph Mengele, was one of the best-known scholars of classical literature and great books in Germany. So the books themselves do not necessarily lead to humanity. However, if it's a start, it's a beginning. It's a way of starting to look at the world. And I think becomes, as far as I'm concerned, the essence of a curriculum for our time and for the future.
And then my second question was, you mentioned Alan Bloom, and you also mentioned Shakespeare. And Alan Bloom has a book, Shakespeare Politics, and one of the essays is about Othello. And I think sort of the thrust of that essay and his interpretation and what he thinks Shakespeare's getting at was the limits of a cosmopolitanism of Othello trying to assimilate into Venetian society, and that playing his background, his ethnicity and all that, playing a sort of role in his psychology. So yes, common humanity, and yes, this and that, but isn't there a certain limit to our cosmopolitanism?
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree more with Alan Bloom. One of the things that was very interesting, I had a colleague named Herman Kahn, who was the founder of the Hudson Institute and a dear friend of mine. And Herman used to say that the average person has a much better view of what's going on in the world than the typical graduate from an American elite university. He always used to use the expression that Thorsten Veblen once used, that the university students who graduate from our elite institutions are trained in incapacity. And I said to Herman, what do you mean by that? He said, let's take a test. Let's go down the street. There was a grocer not very far from Croton on the Hudson where the institute was located. And this guy is a grocer and no formal education of any kind. He said, I'm going to ask him a question, and then we're going to go ask some scholar a question. I said, Herman, what's the question? He said, well, the question I'm going to ask the grocer is, there's an airport, and at this airport, there are a lot of cars that want to get as close to the terminal as possible. And tell me how we work out a system where people who live in the community can get as close to the terminal as possible. Grocer, without even hesitating one beat, said, oh, very simple, develop a pricing system. People who are willing to pay more get closer to the terminal. People who pay less get further away. And if you don't want to pay anything, you're almost outside the terminal, the airport completely. Very sensible response. Okay, let's ask the scholar. We go to scholar. Oh, it's an allocational system. People who live in the community should have access to the closest destination to the terminal doors. And people who aren't from the community, they're going to go outside. Not workable. An allocational system doesn't work. The guy who's the grocer who deals every day with financial matters, that is, he has to buy food, he has to sell food, he understands finances. The scholar does not. So there are limits to cosmopolitanism. But let me tell you something. In reading the great books, this is one of the first things that you learn. Shakespeare understood that, and not only Shakespeare. The limits of rationality in Kant clearly suggest that as well, so that you can get an understanding of the limits of cosmopolitanism. And I see it all the time with sophisticated New Yorkers who think they understand the world, how the world works, but by and large understand only their own very provincial view. And it may come from the reading of the New York Times, which they regard as the Bible, but you know, it's not, the world isn't only told through the pages, the editorial pages of the New York Times. So yeah, I think that there are limits, and it's certainly something that you want to convey to students. But the books themselves do that. Yes, sir.
Sorry, if I may
My
come
friend
back
from
to-
Transylvania, yes.
Sorry, if I may come back to your long answer from earlier. Where do we go from here? Because the reality that you describe is one that we see every day.
Okay, look, I'll tell you where I think we should go. My own feeling is that what you have in university life today is a real problem. But the problem is addressed not because we're going to turn universities around overnight. This is not going to happen. It's like attempting to turn a battleship around. But one of the things that occurs is there are beachheads that are possible in universities. And my good friend, Professor Coons, has established a beachhead in Western civilization. And my friend Robbie George has established a beachhead at Princeton in the Madison program. And my friend Di Tommaso has established a program on Western civilization at Brown University. There are beachheads that are possible all across the United States, in part because most faculty members, as I indicated to you before, don't really have a sense or purpose for higher education. And so I like to think that these beachheads in time will change the character of the institution. Keep in mind, at the left has done something very, very prominent, and that was in the 1920s when Antonio Gramsci, the famous Italian communist, said, we must march through the institutions and take them over. They did. You look at Hollywood, you look at publishing industry, you look at newspapers, you look at major TV programs, you look at university life. They've taken over. Look at the major committees in your university. When I was in university life at NYU, we'll talk about an odd institution, I was the faculty senate, as I mentioned to Professor Coons earlier, had a vote, every single vote, whatever was on, with disinvestment or whatever the vote was on, was always 77-1. I was doing always 77-1. I always say to the president of the university, can we have a roll call vote, please, so I can express my displeasure? I mean, it was ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. And I think that the only way in which you're going to change university is gradually. We march through the institutions, but we march through the institutions by putting together programs that make sense, that represent the best of our traditions, and that serve as beachheads for the establishment of Western civilization.
Wouldn't it also be necessary to start at the elementary schools and the high schools, and particularly the teachers who go there who now are in first, second, third generation of exposure to what I would agree is less than adequate curriculum? Because if we don't start there, then we'll have a perpetuation of what's the professors, majority of professors are teaching in the universities now.
Look, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I was asked to talk about university life, but if you want me to talk about elementary and secondary education in the United States, I'm prepared to do so. I mean, I think your observation is correct. We have seen a dramatic diminution in the quality of students graduating from high schools and even elementary schools. There was a book that was written several years ago called The Winds of Change. It was about a Kansas family, and the young lady who wrote the book included in the text an examination that she was given to get out of the 8th grade. And I decided to give this examination to students that entered my college. Couldn't pass it. I also did something else that was kind of interesting. I was very curious about this. I had been in Japan, and at Kyoto University, which is one of the elite institutions in Japan, they have an entrance examination. Well, I wasn't going to ask students to take the whole entrance examination. I only asked them to take the portion of the entrance examination that dealt with Western civilization. And I asked questions like, who is Charles Martel, and about various battles and Napoleonic Wars. And I just asked them to take that portion of the test. I never had a student in an honors college that I was dean of that could pass that examination. So I think there's a real problem. I think it's very true. We have lost the sense of the quality that was once engendered in our elementary and secondary schools. The standards have changed. In part, the standards have changed, as I indicated in my paper, because we have tried so hard to address the new demographics, to be accommodating to groups that came into the United States. Now, the difference in the assimilation patterns of the past is that if you turn to the period of great immigration in America from 1880 to 1924, what was true is that the people who came to the United States had to adapt to the American system. Now the American system adapts to the people who are here. And that has led to a decline in the quality of the education that we provide. Bilingual education is one manifestation of this problem. I mean, if people are here, they should speak the language of this country. And if they do not, then they're going to be severely handicapped. And I remember engaging in a debate with a fellow who was sort of arguing on the Hispanic side that they should speak the Spanish language. And we went back and forth in the course of this debate, and a woman who was in the audience was becoming increasingly irritated. And she rose and she provided the best response that I could possibly think of to this fellow who was arguing that Spanish should be used in the United States. She said, I'm Hispanic. I work very hard to take care of my children, but I didn't raise my son to be a busboy. End of debate. He had nothing to say because she didn't want her son handicapped. If he could only speak Spanish in an English-speaking nation, he will be handicapped for the rest of his life. But unfortunately, we have educators who do not see the world that way. And we not only see it in the decline, we also see it in a variety of other ways. We're in elementary schools where at one point you recognize the fact that this was an imperfect nation, but we had so many significant contributions that students should be aware of. Now we only talk about the blemishes in American history. So slavery is emphasized. Now again, I think students are handicapped. They should learn about slavery, don't misunderstand. But I went through a textbook, a series of textbooks in American history. It's my own discipline. And one of the things that I found, which was very interesting, is that a fellow named Crispus Attucks was given more attention than either Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, or Jefferson. Now, Crispus Attucks was a mulatto who was a blacksmith and got caught in the exchanges at the Boston Massacre. Unfortunately, this guy was crossing the street at the wrong time. And it's a terrible thing. But he is not more important in the history of the United States than Jefferson, Hamilton, and Washington. Now, to emphasize the life of Crispus Attucks at the same time that you neglect the lives of the people who built the nation is doing a disservice to kids of any color, any background, any ethnicity. You're not doing them a service. Because you're persuading them about an America that has nothing at all to do with the realities of this history. So I am very much opposed to what goes on in much of the schools today. And it's not only the politicization, as I suggested, it's the dumbing down that occurs as well. Yes?
Actually, there's a question over here. Let me get that first, and I'll come back. Jan.
I just want to back up what you're saying about bilingual education because I tutor kids in East Austin, Hispanic kids, and third graders, and they want to learn English. They want to learn to read English, and it breaks my heart because they're being taught in Spanish, and I'm required to tutor them in Spanish. I mean, I sneak in some English because I want it, but it really is doing them a disservice. And by the time they're in 5th grade, it's very hard for
increasingly
them
more
to learn to
difficult,
read
yes.
English. I mean, they're stuck.
Yeah.
The other point I was going to make is my son's a grad student in material science, and almost all his peers are not American because they can't do the math. And I see it as a threat to our national security that we're not requiring the math and science as well.
Well, you raise an interesting question. It's one that we address at the Institute an awful lot, and it's the role of competitiveness of the United States vis-a-vis China and other nations. China is now producing 3 times the number of engineers that we do. They put an emphasis on technical education. I had an amusing experience with a Chinese dean who came to the United States and said to me, "What would you consider to be the ideal curriculum?" And I said, "Well, 1 part social science, 1 part humanities, 1 part science." He said, "What is this humanities business?" He said, "We're not interested in humanities. We're interested in science." And I think there's no question they put an emphasis on technology and science. That's what they want their students to learn. And what's happened in the United States is almost a function of the Buddenbrooks, where the first generation, you build an enterprise. The second generation is you sustain it. And the third generation, they want to be violinists and guitar players. And we have a lot of violinists and guitar players. I mean, at NYU, when I was at NYU, the most popular program in the university, by far, was the filmmaking school. Now, most people who are in the school of filmmaking end up as driving cabs in New York. But there was no question that that's when everyone wanted to be the next Martin Scorsese who went to the school, or Spike Lee, the people who have graduated from that school. That's what they want to do. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with making movies, but what I'm suggesting is, you have to know something in order to make a film, and you also have to have people in your society who are really engaged in significant technical innovation. And if you don't have mathematicians, it's a problem. And the last point I would make about that, even the sciences, and something like math, has been politicized. At the University of California, for example, in its engineering school, they had many fewer women than men. I'm not going to get into the Larry Summers argument here. But there are many fewer women than men. And so the argument was made, how do we balance the number of female entrants into the program as males? And they said, well, we'll simply have to have a different math requirement for females who are entering the School of Engineering. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not going to be so confident about crossing a bridge that's going to be built by someone who doesn't understand algorithms. I got a real problem. And I've got a real problem in thinking about the kind of computers the computer software we're going to develop if people know nothing about mathematics. These are real issues. And I think they become issues for the nation. Now, the president has talked about, improving standards. But the problem is it has to go all the way down to elementary school, as this gentleman suggested before. And if you look at the teachers in America and the people who have, as a group, the aggregate teaching population, they have the lowest SAT scores of those people who enter American universities today. And Rita Kramer's very famous book, The Follies of Higher Education, she talks about these schools of education, which really do not have any standards. And if you don't know a discipline, how are you going to teach the kids? I mean, you may know how to how to make kids attentive in class, or the psychology of education. But if you don't know a discipline, very, very difficult to convey any knowledge to students. In many instances, these teachers are only a chapter ahead of their students in the subjects they're teaching. Well, look, I mean, all of my life and everything that I've ever encountered, competition is desirable. The only way to achieve excellence is through competition. If you can create an environment where you have competing schools, I think it has a desirable, a very salutary effect. I've never met a parent in my life who said, I want an inferior education for my kid. Whether the parent is black or white, Hispanic or non-Hispanic, poor or rich, I've never met that parent who says, I want inferior education. So everyone wants a superior education. Well, the only way you're going to get it is to have competitive schools.
Do you have a question?
I came in when Taft was going to dinner, so you might have already mentioned, but I wanted to know specifically what do you consider, well, what would you have be core curriculum today? You mentioned
Well,
it,
this gentleman asked me that question before, and I started to talk about the nature of the great books that I think are desirable for students to read. And I said, if you're really looking at Western civilization, a Western civilization program, you start with the Bible, you look at Plato and Aristotle, you read Shakespeare, you read Aeschylus, you read Euripides. I mean, it's not too difficult to put together a great books program. The fact is that there is a traditional program that makes a lot of sense, that argues, I think, for the best and the most interesting and the most innovative ideas in Western civilization. And yes, Karl Marx belongs in the great books list, even if I disagree with him. So the fact is that it's the works that have had the most lasting quality and the works that represent the aspirations, interests, weaknesses, frailties of human beings.
So besides that, like foreign language.
Oh, look, now you want a whole college curriculum. You want the whole college curriculum? Yes, I want a foreign language. I want students to be certainly literate in mathematics. I think students should know something about other civilizations. I'm certainly not opposed to that, as I suggested before. They should know something about their own history. Yeah, I mean, I can put together a curriculum for you, but that's a whole college curriculum. I was simply providing the introduction to what I consider to be the basis of Western civilization.
Hi. I had two things, and I've forgotten one. So,
happens to me all the time. By the
I
way.
know, it's birthdays or something. I, too, was a bilingual or English second language teacher, but in the high school for newcomers. And in Texas or in Austin, that was limited basically to 2 years, in which English mainly, was English and reading were taught, and they got some help with other core curriculum, especially in middle school where I started. And I agree, these kids wanted to learn English, and their parents wanted them to learn English. And they could not graduate or get a decent job without it, much less go on to college. But we had some stellar examples. One young man who went on to Notre Dame and studied architecture. There are those people, and I agree. But I don't think that if we don't make some efforts in that area, in that direction, to teach them English, then they're not going to be able to succeed in other subjects.
Well, as I indicated before, I mean, if you don't teach a subject well, or you don't teach it at all, there's no reason to believe that students are going to know anything. And bilingualism is yet another example of what I would call the Orwellian language change that's occurred in America. It's not bilingualism, it's unilingualism, and it's not English, it's Spanish. And if we're bilingualism, I'd have no problem. I think it's a wonderful thing if people can speak English and Spanish, or English and French, or English and Russian. It doesn't make any difference to me. But the language of this nation is English, and if you don't speak it, you're handicapped. And I don't like to see students who are handicapped. You want to provide every opportunity that's possible for kids. And that's one of the things that I believe in, that it's important for universities and all institutions to provide opportunities so that kids could succeed. That doesn't mean they all will succeed. But the only way in which they are going to succeed is to have some basics, to understand those basics. And the argument that I often have with university life is that very often what you have are programs that are put in place that allow for expression, not for learning, where people will come. Look, feminist studies would be perfectly acceptable to me if you studied Sappho and Jane Austen and great women who Marie Curie. But if it's nothing more than an attempt on the part of women to sit in a room and talk about the oppression that they feel from males in society, that's not a learning experience. And Chicano studies would be fine. So you read Cervantes. I mean, look, I could certainly put together a Spanish studies program in the university that would be very effective. But if the Spanish studies program is nothing more than people saying, look, Chicanos don't have an opportunity to get ahead in America, and you have white dominance, and I'm going to express my displeasure, this is nothing more than emoting. That's not education. This is expression. So when I talked about the studies programs, and I talked about environmental oppression, all of the oppressions, what I now call victimology, which is a part of the American curriculum, that has nothing to do with education. This has something to do with people expressing their dismay with the existing conditions in American life. I don't see that as having any value.
I have a kind of a different kind of question, but I've been out of the university for a long time, and my son is just about to graduate with an anthropology degree. And he continues to mention Lacan, and I think you mentioned that name. And would you enlighten me who this guy is? I mean, I constantly talks about this guy, and I've heard him mentioned in these lectures before, and I don't know who this is.
Well,
could you?
Lacan,
am I the only one?
French psychologist who emphasized the idea of relativism, and the relativism suggested that there's no such thing as normality. Normality is largely a subjective condition. Now, if you've been on the streets of New York and you've seen the homeless people who unfortunately are really in a terrible state, suffering from various kinds of mental problems, you can't accept the idea of Lacan. It's ridiculous. But it is a form of relativism, and unfortunately what has happened in cultural anthropology, and Dr. Kuntz and I were talking about this before, is built into cultural anthropology the unwillingness to put values on any culture. Now, last night I had the great pleasure of spending some time with a woman I greatly admire. She's one of my heroines, named Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She's a Muslim woman who, as some of you know, wrote a famous book called Infidel, and she was the woman who wrote the script for Submission. That's one of the reasons then that led to the death of Theo van Gogh, who was the director of that film. And she gives a speech that I very much like. She talks about, in the Muslim world, women are 1/2 or 1/3 of what a man is. And if you go into court and you claim you were raped, you have to get testimony from 3 women, and that was true, even if a man says, no, I deny it. One man. So the woman really doesn't count in the society. So she comes to the West. As if you read the book or you know her story, she went through various peregrinations to come, including lying about her background because she was forced into a marriage that she didn't want. So she ends up in Holland, and she goes into the West. And one of the first things that happens, she's invited to a party, a social event, walks into the party, and this gentleman who's with her says, "Ladies first." He opens the door for her. She starts to cry. He said, "I've never been in an experience where ladies are first. Ladies are always last. I didn't understand it." And she would be the first person to tell you, there's a difference between cultures. There are some that are superior and some that are inferior. And a culture that would say ladies first is a superior culture. Now, the problem with cultural anthropology, it starts with a relativist supposition. That's why Lacan is often mentioned by your son and by others, because there is no, you don't make any value judgments. All cultures are what they are. Oh, some have clitodectomies. That's what they do in that culture. We can't make any value judgments. We can't say it's wrong. Well, I would say it's wrong, because if you know something about civilization, there are some things that are right and wrong. And it's true that it's very often difficult to determine. But if you've been, to some degree, brainwashed into believing that there is no right and wrong, and all cultures are the same, just some different, then in fact it's very difficult to make value judgments. I obviously don't mince my words.
Yeah, I know. I know she's...
Happy to do it.
Doc, I want you to know you're one of the best speakers I've ever heard.
Well, it's very kind of you to say, sir. Thank you.
My question is, what is your next challenge?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
What is your next challenge? What are you working on now?
Well, I left university life after 35 years in the academy. I established a college called the Gallatin School, as was mentioned before. It was organized around the study of great books. And my friend John O'Sullivan, who wrote a very interesting book recently called "The President, the Pope, and the President, the Prime Minister, and the Pope," he told me on one occasion, there's something that's axiomatic about higher education. Things that are not avowedly traditional will end up being radical. I didn't understand that. Now I do. I founded this college, and the Great Books program that I talked about before was implemented in the college I created with Shakespeare and the Bible and the readings that I've mentioned. But my successor came from a very different tradition. She believed, and she said so publicly in the pages of the New York Times, that it's more important for students to read Toni Morrison than Shakespeare. So she put together a program that became what was ostensibly a affirmative action program of great books. So you have to have Frantz Fanon, you have to have Shulamith Firestone, you have to have Toni Morrison. So now the Great Books program that I had put in place didn't resemble a Great Books program as I understand it. And Dr. Kuntz, I think, quite appropriately said, why didn't they just call it a kind of middle-range Great Books program? But this was not a Great Books program as I understood it. So I was in a very awkward position, even though I had retired as dean, to send a letter to the president of the university asking to have my portrait removed from the school. I didn't want to be associated with the school that I gave birth to. And that, in some ways, was a truly lamentable but eye-opening experience for me. And it demonstrated something about the politicization of higher education. But as far as my own projects are concerned, I left the academy and got very much involved with a place called the Hudson Institute, which is a think tank. And we worry about everything from nuclear proliferation, trying to provide guidance to various governments. We do a fair amount of work on how to deal with this whole question of radical Islam. We have a number of journals that we put out that deal with that question. And we have a number of people that you would know who are on my staff, Robert Bork, Scooter Libby, Erwin Stelzer, Michael Horowitz, Anders Wimbush, names that appear in the pages of the Wall Street Journal on a fairly regular basis. So my projects, I'm traveling the globe trying to deal with issues from Japan to the Middle East. And so I spend a good deal of time traveling. My wife has made the point that it's my husband's peregrinations. I'm always on the move. But thank you for your comments, sir.
Yes, just following up on your experiences with the Gallatin School, how do you protect great books programs?
Oh, it's a good question. I mean, I wish I knew the answer. I don't know the answer. All I can tell you is that the founder is critical, and not only the founder, he has to have his progeny. He has to be able to have those students who believe so deeply in the program that they carry the baton to the next generation. I didn't do that. When I hired people of all political persuasions. It didn't make any difference to me if they were communists or they were right-wingers. All I cared about were they devoted to the study of great books. But one of the things that happened as a result of the tenure program is some of the people who were the most traditional, or in this instance most conservative, did not get tenure. That the left managed to find ways to deny tenure to those people. It was a political decision. And so in the end, the character of the program changed. And as I said, it was a truly lamentable situation from my point of view. But you have to make sure that what you're doing is you're passing on the best that you can to your students and to the future leaders of the program. I mean, it's not unlike what happens in a family. You like to think that the traditions that you believe in, notwithstanding the comments that were made by Richard Rorty in my formal comments, that this is going to be passed on to your children, that the things that you believe in, the values that you have are passed on to your kids. I have a daughter who many of you in this room know because she's a television personality, Stacey London, and you watch What Not to Wear or Fashionably Late with Stacey London, Friday nights, 10 o'clock, I advertise for her. In any case, it's a very popular program. And she's often asked, well, do you share your father's politics? Well, in this world of show business, she can't say that she does, but she always says something that I do very much like. And she says, the proprieties that I apply to fashion, because she's always telling women who bear their midriff, cover up, please. She says, the proprieties that I learned, I pass on to others. That's where I got my grounding. And that's not unlike what you have to do in a program in a university. You have to give people a kind of enthusiasm and background and understanding, so they want to pass this on, they want to transmit this knowledge to another generation. And that, by the way, used to be one of the characteristics of higher education. One of the things that I love to do is to look at the statement, the mission statement that existed in American universities in the 19th century. And they always say the same thing. Almost every, whether it's Yale, Harvard, any university, they all say the same thing. We want to transmit the best of our civilization to the next generation. No one says that anymore because they don't know what the best is. Yes, sir.
Well, thank you for staying so long. It's very enjoyable and educational.
I'm here. I've got nowhere else to go. I don't have a family here in Texas, so I'm with you as long as you like.
Thanks. Another comment, question. Victor Hansen seems to put a good deal of emphasis on living with the earth, doing practical things, being involved in activities that are finite and that do have not necessarily a right and wrong, but certainly a cause and effect over time. Would some type of inclusion of that type of activity in people's lives be beneficial in plowing the land or fertilizing the mind in terms of gaining a better appreciation of the value of the Western classical education?
I think Victor is absolutely right. Look, there are two conditions that used to meld into higher education. One was heuristic. By heuristic, I mean using the work of other scholars and research and using our libraries to understand the past. And the other is propedeutic. Propedeutic is practical dimensions of life, using your hands, understanding what goes into the ground, understanding what comes out of the ground. I remember that my daughter had a friend, and we went to the supermarket together, and I asked her, where does a turkey come from? Because we were buying turkey for Thanksgiving. And she said, well, it comes from the freezer. I mean, it's the freezer compartment. That's where turkey comes from. I mean, the idea that this was an animal, they had to slaughter it, that it was then taken to a supermarket so beyond her ken. She just didn't get it. And you're absolutely right. I mean, Victor Davis Hanson, I think, is, he's in California, he works in a vineyard, so he understands the nature of the soil, the changing seasons, the nutrients in that soil. These are very important dimensions of life. And unfortunately, what has happened in the society that is now an information age, people don't use their hands, they don't do anything that's practical. And I do think that we've lost something. I think you're absolutely correct, or he's correct.
Well, and one of the points that he makes is that in ancient Greece, before the Peloponnesian Wars, it took about 9 of the 10 people working in agriculture to sustain the economy, and it was at the time of the Peloponnesian Wars when the tactics of, and I forget his name, the general, of putting a wall around Athens and on out to the sea, where everyone came into Athens instead of protecting their farmland because they didn't want to have a pitched battle with the Spartans. So that goes way back, and at the time, there are a lot of these classics and the lifestyle around them seems to be consistent with that point.
Well, almost everything that you would describe as practical in the contemporary age that is now based on artificial considerations, largely due to the internet and advanced technology, it takes us away, at least in a secondary or tertiary stage, from the basic considerations of life. This is what advanced technology has done. So we are far more removed from what I would have described as a propedeutic experience. The illustration that I used before with the grocer and then the scholar, I think I can reproduce that today. I think there are still people who have not had a formal education, but as a result of the experiences that they've had in life, they have a better understanding of how the world works than many formal scholars. Again, I refer to my mom, who is past this mortal coil, but my mom used to be able to do a New York Times crossword puzzle in 20 minutes. I could not. And as I said, she was a high school dropout. She left after her sophomore year in high school, largely to earn an income. So it tells you a great deal. But books were a very much important part of her life. And she recognized the importance of learning. So she didn't have to go to school to learn. She learned on her own.
It seems to me, when you made reference to the professors not getting tenure, it seems to me in the 40 years since I got my master's degree from the university here, that so much of a professor's teaching is affected by his politics. And it didn't seem to be that way 40 years ago, and that the teaching or the lectures was objective and neutral, and it wasn't tainted by the professor's particular politics. And I think this is a detriment, and I was wondering, is there anything we could do to get it back to where professors are not, instead of advocating their political views, are teaching the subjects from an objective or neutral standpoint?
Well, look, I couldn't agree with you more. I think we've seen the politicization of higher education. That was the point that I was making in my formal remarks. Exactly. One dimension of the great change that's occurred in higher education from roughly the 60s to the present is politicization. And it occurs in the tenure process, and it occurs in the way new programs are organized. Look, take, for example, what happens in the academy today and how difficult it is to change it. I'll give you an illustration. We have something called feminist studies, which, as I've already suggested to you, is nothing more than expression studies. It's not really the formal study of women in history. So you have expression studies. Faculty has to vote on this. And I say to the faculty members, many of them opposed to the idea, what do you think? Well, no one is going to say I'm opposed, because if they do, they're going to be chastised by their colleagues. So no one has the courage to stand up, I'm opposed. No. So they say, okay, we'll have feminist studies. Feminist studies program is organized. They have a lot of women who now join the program. It's a very easy program because all you have to do is to engage in a lot of expression, be very dramatic, talk about the difficulties that you face, the oppression that you face from men. And then these people say, well, how about a master's degree program? I mean, look at all the students that we have. We're generating a lot of revenue for the university. Okay, they have a master's degree program. Then they say, well, you know what? We're going to go to the American Historical Association. We're going to go to the American Philosophical Association. We're going to the American Political Science Association. And we need a feminist division within those institutions because they don't really put sufficient emphasis on the role that women play in history and philosophy and political science. So now you get a feminist studies division. Now they say, well, you know what? We need tenure. well, everyone else in the university gets tenure. How can you deny them tenure? So now tenure is given to the feminist studies professors. Now that they have tenure, what do they want to do? They want to reproduce themselves with a PhD program where the students getting PhDs can now be in the feminist studies program. How could you deny them a PhD? They just gave them a master's degree. Now, in order to get the PhD, you have to have a publishing history. So let's put together a journal. Now, I'm not making this up. This is really true, so excuse the expression. There is a journal in feminist studies called Clitoral Hermeneutics. Even if I wanted to make it up, I couldn't. So now I've published 15 articles for clitoral hermeneutics. All right, look how productive I am. 15 articles in clitoral hermeneutics. So yes, let's make this person a professor in the program and distinguished status. So how do you deal with the superstructure? Once the structure is created, it is very, very hard to undo. And this is what I mean by the extent of politicization. It is very much a part of what university education has become. Now, there was a time, God knows how many years ago, a very long time ago, as a professor in the university, as a professor as was a student in the university, professors tended to lean to the left. Didn't make any difference because there was a kind of fairness, a well-understood idea. And the AAUP, in writing its famous statement in 1915 about academic freedom, and then repeated in 1947 after the war, they said, look, you are perfectly free to express your views in a university with the understanding that you express your views in an area of competence. That's what academic freedom was. So there's enormous latitude within your areas of competence. So if you're teaching a course in music, you shouldn't be expressing views about Ahmadinejad. That's not academic freedom. You're not really covered by it. Now, you're covered by freedom of speech. That professor can go on a soapbox in front of the University of Texas and talk about Ahmadinejad, but not in his classroom. Now, it's completely changed. Even the AAUP doesn't understand its own codified rules. And so freedom of speech is given to everyone. Lord Churchill wants to talk about the Eichmanns who were killed in the World Trade Center. Well, okay, fortunately he was fired. But for a while, he is now a very prominent spokesman in American universities. And so this is what I regard as one of the great dangers. We have had the Latinization of American universities, where in fact politics plays a very important role because professors are there to preach, not to teach. They're there because they want to convince you that the views that you brought into the academy are wrong and that you have to be sanitized. This is like the University of Peking. We're going to put you through deconditioning. So I think that it's a real problem. And I know it sounds like it's an exaggeration, but I've rarely encountered an example where you get this free flow of ideas and a free exchange of ideas. My daughter, excuse me for going on so long, my daughter's a student in Northwestern, so she takes a course called Politics in America. It's an introductory course at Northwestern University. Lecturer does a reasonably good job, seems to be very fair, but then they break up into recitation sessions, small groups, group of 10 or 15 kids. So she's in a classroom with 15 other students, and the teacher the first day of the class says, there aren't any opportunities to get ahead in America. Okay? Second class, she says, we have what is ostensibly a caste system in the United States, not a class system. There is no opportunity. There is no ventilation, no movement up and down the class system. So it's a caste system. Third is that this is basically a racist society. Well, now my daughter has had it. So she says to the instructor, politely, because my daughter is very, very polite, very careful. And she says, excuse me, but I really think that there are many more opportunities than you might think. And in addition, people move up and down in the class system dramatically. The third and fourth generation of the Rockefellers did not do quite as well as John D. Rockefeller. And you can see this all across the line with people who are in the bottom quintile move up into the middle class, and people who are in the middle class sometimes move to the upper class, and the upper class sometimes move down. Teacher says to her, rather than respond, teacher says to her, what's your political affiliation? So my daughter says, what bearing does that have on the argument? I mean, if my argument is incorrect, provide me with evidence. She says, what, are you afraid to tell us what your political affiliation is? So my daughter says, I'm a Republican. She says to her, well, you don't have to come to this class anymore. It's not necessary to come to this class because I could have guessed what your views are. Because she didn't agree with the ideological position of this instructor, she was told you don't have to come to class. Now, my daughter, who's very clever, wrote an article for the alternative newspaper in Northwestern. And it led to this grand brouhaha, and the chairman of the department talked to the instructor, and I was very glad about the way things unfolded. But it's clearly demonstrative of what you will find in universities today. That's not so unusual. Everywhere. And so I think it's a real problem. You raise the right issues, sir. But I don't know the answer to it. I don't know the answer. I talked about the beachheads where fairness prevails. I'm not interested in necessarily promoting my line. I'm not interested in promoting my point of view. I have no desire for propagandistic purposes. But I do think a university should be a place for the free exchange of ideas, for the open exchange of ideas, for different points of view to be expressed. And if we have nothing but an orthodoxy, that is not a university education.
I have a
Yes. How many women at the Hudson Institute? Carol Edelman, Zainab Baran. I would say about 20, 25% of the people at the Institute. We have 63 people. I would say about 20 are women. I don't know, is there a point?
I think you might have skirt around this answer, but I wanted to know, like how would we go about changing the way education? Like, how would we instill, like, from bottom up, from parents to say, here's a good education, and try to pursue that, and how would we totally.
Look, there are people who have a very good idea of the standards that are needed in the academy. And you haven't had Harvey Mansfield speak here, but he's a guy at Harvard who I think has a very good sense of how a university education should be established. You had Robbie George, and I think Robbie is a wonderful spokesman, and Robbie did put together a terrific program at Princeton. As I indicated to you before, there are these beachheads. We should look to these places as examples of what we want to reproduce. They should be the models that we inculcate at universities across the country. These are the people who are making a difference. And as I said, there are enough of them so that we can have these models. I remember when I was a student, and when I went to university, involved in university life, I was far more interested in playing basketball than studying great books. But I met a professor named Jacques Barzin, just celebrated his 100th birthday here in Texas. And I got so excited by being in his class. He said to me, Herb, you really want to get educated? Go to the library, go to the A's, and when you finish with the A's, go to the B's. When you finish with the B's, go to the C's. Of course, that would take a lifetime. But I'll tell you something. It had such a profound effect on me. I wanted to emulate myself, just like Jacques. I wanted to speak French. I wanted to be French. I wanted to dress like Jacques Barzin. I wanted to be Jacques Barzin. And so there are models like that in life. And curiously, every once in a while, those models have just tremendous influence on people. And when I became a dean at the university, I one day was asked to raise some money for my school, and there was a company in New York called St. Joe's Minerals, later bought by the Fluor Corporation in California, so it's no longer in existence. And I went to see the fellow who was involved in public affairs for this mineral company, and I said, sir, I'm from New York University, I'm a dean of a college, it's a great books program, I would like to talk to you about what we do, and maybe you would consider making a contribution. He looked at me and he said, I can't stand these academics. I said, well, I may even share your view. What's your problem? He said, well, they're so pompous. I mean, the pomposity is extraordinary. I just can't deal with them. So I was about to put on my coat and leave. I mean, what can I say? I'm one of those people. I'm in that clan. I said, well, sir, can you give me any examples? He says, there's an expression that academics use. They use it all the time. It's clearly a signal to me of pomposity, and they use it all the time, and every time I hear it, my blood curdles. I said, oh, I know what that is. He said, no, you don't. I said, sir, I do. He said, what is the expression? The expression is in terms of. Academics always say in terms of the weather or in terms of these conditions. Well, conditions are not terms. Terms are X and Y. Those are terms. So they always use the expression inappropriately. Clear sign. How did I know that? Jacques Barzin wrote that in Teacher in America in the 1930s. He says whenever an academic uses that expression, you know he doesn't know what he's talking about. It was, excuse the expression, a kind of bullshit detector. So Jacques taught me that. So the first thing I did when I left Mr. Carlisle's office at St. Joe's is I called up Jacques. I said, you know something? I just got a check for $37,500. Thank you so much. He had no idea what I was talking about. No idea at all. But it was one of those moments. And I still think that there are people like that in the academy today. There aren't too many of them, but these are the people who could make a difference, and they should serve as the models. And if there was only some way of cloning them, I would be happy to do that. Not that I believe in cloning. Yes, ma'am.
Another thing that David Horowitz, you might be aware of his efforts.
Sure. No, David very well.
He students who are persecuted, like your daughter, sometimes have to bypass the dean because the deans are intimidated and go to the legislature. And the legislatures have, I think in Pennsylvania is one place, said students have an academic Bill of Rights and free speech and have taken these teachers to task.
Well, look, I'm one of the founders of an organization that Dr. Coons knows very well called the National Association of Scholars. And my colleague Steve Balch was the person who testified with David Horowitz at the Pennsylvania legislature. And there were a number of legislators in Pennsylvania who recognized the fact that we are now engaged in a form of propaganda in the Institute. However, one of the difficulties that occurred in Pennsylvania is there were a lot of people who not only graduated from institutions in Pennsylvania, but are responsible for serving on committees that provide funds to these institutions. They weren't so happy about David Horowitz or my colleague Steve Balch. Not so happy. And so in the end, while there was a lot of Sturm und Drang, very little happened. Now, the congressman from New Hampshire is starting to understand this and has a bill in the Congress for fair and open discussion in the academy. Things that you would think would be very fundamental. You don't need legislation to say that, but in these times you do need that legislation. Judd, that's Congressman Judd. So I think that people are starting to become aware of it, but ultimately it's dependent on parents and alumni and trustees and donors. When I talked about Alan Bloom a little while ago, Alan Bloom is, died a number of years ago, but when the book came out, Closing the American Mind, I had lunch with Alan in the Chicago Club. And Alan looked at me and said, I don't understand this. I write a very serious book that has now sold 10 million copies. I've become an enormously wealthy man, and I don't understand it. The second half of the book deals with the Nietzscheanization of America. Who reads this? I said, Alan, I know exactly what happened. Most people are not reading this book. They say it's a very good book, but they don't read it. They read the first couple of chapters. And the first couple of chapters talks about all of the things that I've discussed this evening, including the politicization of higher education. And I said, here is my theory about the success of the book. Kids come home from the university, they say to their parents, you're bourgeois pigs. You don't understand. You don't understand the polity in which you reside. You don't understand that this is basically a racist society. And so the parents say, you know what, let's invest $25 in Alan Bloom's book so we can find out why we're pissing away $25,000. So this is a pretty decent trade-off. He looked at me, he used to puff his cigarettes, take long pauses, took a long pause, pregnant pause, and he said, absolutely right.
Well, great. On that high note, we'll wrap it up, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Herb. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the kind words. We appreciate it.
Not so bad for no questions. You started out with no questions. You got lots of questions.
Always happens.